Hello, and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast, where we go deep on the sport of gravel cycling through in-depth interviews with product designers, event organizers, and athletes who are pioneering the sport. I'm your host, Craig Dalton, a lifelong cyclist who discovered gravel cycling back in 2016 and made all the mistakes you don't need to make. I approach each episode as a beginner to unlock all the knowledge you need to become a great gravel cyclist. This week on the podcast, we welcome Andrew Juskatis from Giant Bicycles to the show. Andrew is a global product marketing manager and had a hand in the launch of the new Revolt X gravel bike. I have to say, after I saw former guest and friend Yuri Oswald riding this new Giant bicycle with a RockShox suspension fork on it, I couldn't resist reaching out to the team at Giant to learn a little bit more. I'd been curious as to when we'd start to see larger manufacturers bring suspension forks into the gravel bike world. I know it is a topic that many of you feel very passionately one way or the other about, but I thought it would be interesting to talk to Andrew about that decision and how they see the market evolving. Giant is a close to 50, maybe 50 plus year old company that's been producing bikes for many, many other brands, as well as developing their own brand back in the 80s. They've got a huge amount of research and development and organizational strength in the engineering department. So it was exciting to talk to them about what they were seeing with this bicycle. Obviously, they have models available with and without that RockShox. We talk about the Revolt X model, as well as one of the other models that shares a similar chassis, but not an identical chassis. And we'll get into why Giant was uniquely capable of producing something specific for running a suspension fork versus just slapping something on the same bike or the same frame that they had produced for the non-suspension model. Anyway, I look forward to you listening to this conversation. Andrew and I are contemporaries, so we share some stories about our early experience in the mountain bike market and the evolution of that market and some of the parallels we're seeing in the gravel world. With that said, let's jump right into my conversation with Andrew. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Craig.
It's good to have you. I feel like I've been wanting to have someone on from Giant for a few years now, and I couldn't resist reaching out through my friend Yuri Oswald, who just started riding for Giant USA. When I saw the new Revolt X, it seemed like too much of a bike that was right up my alley not to get someone on the show to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's a new launch for us. It just came out this February, so it's still new, it's still hot, and it's an interesting product from Giant.
Yeah. Before we dig into that, let's just get a little bit about your history. Where did you grow up, and how did you discover the bike, and ultimately, how did you end up working in the bike industry?
Holy cow, that's a long story, but I will try and make it short for you. So I'm coming up on 50 years old. I've been riding and racing bikes, specifically mountain bikes, since I was 14 years old. I grew up in Southern California. I started racing and then riding, around 87, 88. So I've been through almost the full trajectory of mountain biking. As a result of that, my love for cycling has grown. So Southern California guy, went to college, University of Utah, and just absolutely fell in love with the sport of mountain biking. But out of that, I took my first job working for cycling publications. So over a period of 9 years, I worked for 5 different magazines, starting in 1996, working for Mountain Biking, Mountain Biker, Bike Magazine, Bicycling, and then eventually finished off my tenure at Velo News. And throughout that entire time, I was the tech editor for all those publications. I did a lot of product testing and had a pretty good gig doing all that. But it was 2004 when I was an editor. I flew from Colorado out to Southern California to be a guest at Giant Bicycles when they were introducing their Maestro suspension technology. And I remember specifically as an editor riding that product, meeting the people behind the product and saying, hey, Giant has something going on for it. Like, this is legit. Not only is the technology legit, but the people behind it are serious about what they're doing. And it really put Giant on my radar for what is going to be my next job. Lo and behold, position opened up in their marketing department. And 2005, I took the job at Giant. And here I am, some 18 years later, on the other end of the stick here, talking to editors around the world.
Amazing. I love that we're in the same age range and went through sort of our coming up in mountain biking around the same time. I know we could probably share a lot of stories that might not be interesting to our gravel riding audience, but thanks for sharing that. And just for a little bit of context, can you just talk about the origins of the Giant company and the Giant brand?
Yeah, for sure. And for those listeners who aren't aware, we're obviously a legacy brand. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary. And again, another really long story short, the reason why Giant exists is way back in the 70s when Schwinn was having its bicycle boom. Schwinn was manufacturing the great majority of their product, here in the United States. They realized that they needed to expand, they needed to bring prices down to some more affordability. So they sent off kind of their Lewis and Clark guys over to Asia to source out bicycle manufacturing over in Asia. And one of those guys ventured over to Taiwan, which at the time wasn't producing anything to do with bicycles, and fortuitously stumbled across a fledgling little manufacturing company called Giant at the time. At the time, they were not making bicycles, but had the capability to do so. Well, long story short, Giant became the main manufacturer of Schwinn bicycles kind of in the late 70s there. And so they were pumping out the great majority of Schwinn bikes that maybe our parents grew up with or we grew up with as kids. That grew and grew and grew. The manufacturing business continued to improve. The factory got bigger and bigger. We got better at it. And then in the early 80s, we started our own brand. And that's the brand that I work for, which is Giant. That's the brand that most of your listeners are familiar with. So early 80s on that, we started making our own product, unique product, designed, manufactured, and engineered by us. And that's the brand that we're talking about today.
I remember in the very late 80s selling a giant iguana or two on the mountain bike side, if I can name drop that little bit of history to you.
Yeah, that's still a running joke I get all the time. What do you feed the giant iguana? I love oldie but goodie.
And I also remember, obviously, in addition to that Schwinn product line that they were producing for many years, they then expanded to a lot of product for a lot of different manufacturers. And I remember sort of learning that as I was working in a bike shop on the East Coast and realizing that, of the 7 brands that we were selling, 3 or 4 of them were actually produced in the same factory via Giant, which was kind of interesting at the time.
Yeah, for sure. So our manufacturing side of the business does produce bicycles for some other brands out there, but the great majority of product that comes out of our factory is Giant. And just to clarify, anything that comes out of our factory is engineered and designed by that brand. So everything is unique. Like the Giant brand is completely different than anything else that might come out of that factory. But I'm here today to talk about, Giant product and the Giant brand. So excited to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, as we trace back kind of the brand history as you've been there the last 18 years or so, obviously Giant is a full service brand, meaning they're doing everything from kids bikes to Tour de France and, UCI downhill bikes across the product line. When you think about how the brand kind of approaches that entire suite of product, does it sort of come from the top down and you're trying to make the best product possible, or is each kind of division kind of focused on like, oh, I'm trying to make an affordable bike or a commuter bike or what have you, and really just trying to be best of class in the area that it's competing in?
Yeah, first things first is we make sure that we have the right people leading the right categories. From that, every one of those category managers, their goal is to build the absolute best in class for that. Whether it be a youth bike, whether it be a road, gravel, or mountain bike, we always want to shoot for the top. Only after we have all these pieces in place do we start thinking about price points. How do we want to, what price points do we want to hit? We look at, maybe sometimes we'll look at our competitors and see what they're doing and see how we can, beat them. But for the great majority of time, because we are the factory, we have the greatest buying power in the entire cycling industry, if you think about it. I mean, we buy more DRXT rear derailleurs than any other brand on earth. So normally we're always going to get the best pricing out of that. We don't normally focus on pricing. Your listeners can certainly do their own shopping and look at different brands and different prices, but that's certainly something where we differentiate our categories. How do we break it down? And that's something we can talk about when we talk about Revolt X. What are the prices here in the United States?
Yeah, I'm curious and excited, given your tenure at Giant, just when you started to see like a gravel bike first emerge in the lineup. And obviously, the date you dropped to me earlier, I think, was 2013.
Yeah.
The category barely existed at that point. So I'm curious if you recall, like, why was that bike created originally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't want to say it was created by accident, but at the time, you know, the category managers, the marketing staff, we're in touch with the market. We ride a lot. It's our passion. So we're out there and seeing what people are doing. Gravel at the time, from a mass production level, really didn't exist. This is over a decade ago, like you just indicated. The consumers were, maybe the elite, that bleeding edge was kind of experimenting with, taking a road bike and putting on the biggest tires possible and riding it in more aggressive terrain. Um, I would say we caught onto that 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 trend, and it was just a developing trend way back then. And we said, hey, you know what? Let's experiment. It seems like it makes sense. This might actually go somewhere. This might not be a fad like single speeding, right? Like that came and went for the most part. This actually has legs, given the trends at the time of, generally speaking, road bike sales were just beginning to slump off. People might have started getting turned off a little bit about road riding just because of safety issues, or just because of wanting to explore their terrain a little bit more than a traditional road bike could take them. So it was kind of a culmination of a lot of different events. Let us dip our toe in the water with the first Revolt series. And that was like over a decade ago. And looking back at the bike, looking at the geometry, looking at the max tire size, I'm not going to say it was wrong in every way, but it was an experiment, right? It was our first mass production toe dipped in the water. And we learned a tremendous amount from that first generation. So here we are today talking about our latest generation, which is the Revolt X, which, as your listeners know, is a front suspension gravel bike. And
Yeah.
definitely happy to talk about that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like back in that 2013, 2014, 2015, like there was this pocket of riders that weren't necessarily, riding gravel. They were just happened to be riding on dirt roads or wanted a more durable drop bar bike for commuting. And so there was like enough of a pocket in there, despite like people wanting to use the bike for many different things.
Sure.
That type of bike made a lot of sense. And then, as we moved forward into 2015, 2016, you started to sort of see this very much more specialized gravel event happen, and people like really leaning into a gravel bike as a replacement for a road bike potentially in certain scenarios. So talk a little bit, if you can, at sort of a broad level about how you saw the Revolt model evolve over those early years into 2016, 2017.
Right. And so, just like you indicated, Craig, the racing scene at that time was just starting to bubble up, more local events, little kind of underground events. But anytime we create a new product, we do ask ourselves, okay, is this product going to be raced, or is this product going to be ridden? Is this for the adventure rider, or is this for the guy, shaves his legs and has the Liker one piece kit on and is going for the number plate thing? So at that time, we said no on racing, because racing really didn't seem like it was that big a deal. So the original Revolt was geared more towards adventure, was more towards exploration, was riding those B and C level roads, or even some, maybe at the time, very light single track kind of stuff. But it was
And
not about.
was it a carbon bike originally?
No, 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 no.
Yeah.
Again, I would use the term experimental at the time. And so, first generation, I think we talked about this a little bit offline, but committing to composite, cutting molds, is an entirely different thing than building an aluminum bike. Aluminum bikes obviously take a lot of engineering. There is a lot of technology in it, but the commitment level to building an aluminum bike from a mass production standpoint is significantly less than committing to composites. So, like I said, bit of an experiment. The first Revolt, we want to dip our toe in the water. It was aluminum, and so really easy if we needed to. Second generation, if we needed to change geometry, it's very, very easy to do that. Once you cut molds, and I know you and I know a lot of your listeners know this, but once you cut those molds for composite, there's no going back. And I think we talked about this offline. The commitment level to cutting molds for a composite bike can be darn near $100,000 per size. So you need to think about your return on investment when you're committing to composite.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Amazing. Like I love taking this journey with you. And then, as I mentioned to you offline, like I became super attracted, I think, to the Revolt aesthetic and performance attributes in that like 2018 time frame, maybe 2019, but found that it was sort of oriented towards a narrower tire size at that time. Does that kind of track with the sort of design and performance objectives at that time for that model?
Yeah, for sure. At that time, when we're trying to look into our crystal ball of the future, just, point of reference, when we build or create a new range or series of bicycles, we're looking at a 3-year lifespan, no more, absolutely no more than a 5-year lifespan before we're going to come out with the next generation. So 3 years
Okay.
generally. But we
Yeah.
need to look in our crystal ball because we need to see what trends are happening, what trends are growing, and what trends are faltering. At the time, we wanted to kind of maximize tire size without going bonkers. And I know a lot of folks, including yourself, kept screaming for larger and larger tire size. At that second generation Revolt, we didn't feel it was necessary. But when we move into this next generation here, like especially with Revolt X, we can talk about larger tire
Yeah.
size.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's get into it. Let's get into the Revolt, and maybe you can sort of break down. You've got one series that has the RockShox suspension fork and a dropper post, which I
Yeah.
love the idea of,
Yeah.
and then you've got the other sort of standard rigid bike.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great takeoff point, and kind of just for the record, let me state our view of what you just talked about. So currently in our line, we launched this a little over a year ago, was our Revolt Advanced Pro, and that's our composite Revolt bike. That's the bike you're going to see our professional racers on. You're going to see that with most folks should probably pick that bike if they're going to put a number plate on for most type of terrain. And we certainly, in our marketing materials and our communications, we talk about racing openly, freely, and proudly with that bike. No, it is not just a race bike. It's a very lightweight. It can be used for exploration or simply, riding on rougher roads. It's fine. But you will
Yeah,
hear us talk about racing quite a bit with that current model of Revolt Advanced Pro. The
yeah,
bike that we're focusing on today is the Revolt X Advanced Pro, and so that has a suspension fork, just like you said, just like you love, and it has the suspension seat post on it. It does have a little bit of suspension on it, if you notice that in the spec, but the dropper
yeah,
as well. So,
yeah,
not to say that's not a race bike, but we're not going to be positioning it. Our professional racers probably won't be seen racing on that bike. It's a bit more for exploration, really those all-day adventure rides down rougher terrain, which there is certainly a trend for. But just to put it in perspective, in terms of sales numbers, you're going to still see most people choosing the Revolt Advanced Pro, that composite line, for their everyday riding. This Revolt X
yeah.
is for a unique person like yourself, or maybe some of your listeners who want and are asking for more.
Yeah, it's interesting, as when RockShox and SRAM launched that fork,
Yeah,
gosh, maybe a year ago
right.
plus,
Mhm.
like I realized that, the early adopters of that fork were likely going to have to either retrofit it and deal with the geometric changes that it's going to apply to their bike or get a custom frame built because the larger manufacturers just weren't ready to kind of jump on that trend. I think it made sense to like allow RockShox to put it out there in the world alongside what Fox had been doing for
Yeah,
some time earlier than that and just see where it was going to sit. But I was sort of eagerly waiting for a larger brand like Giant to put one on a bike just to expose the world to the attributes of something that was purpose built and designed around that fork. Because to your point, not everybody's racing. And it seems like there is a world and there are locations in the world where this type of suspended gravel bike, while it's still oriented around gravel riding, right? You're still going to ride it on the road in mixed terrain or whatever,
right.
but giving the rider an advantage, whether it's more comfort or stability or safety or performance with that suspension fork was going to be something that is going to appeal to yet these ever more refined niches of gravel that are emerging.
Yeah, it's interesting, Craig. You and I were talking offline before, and I learned a bit about your history, certainly with mountain biking. And we all remember way back in the day when, the RockShox RS1 first came out. It seemed like a gimmick, maybe a novelty, and manufacturers, pretty much all of them, simply took that suspension fork and threw it on an existing frame. And frames back then were all steel, but that was one way to kind of dip their toe in the water to try out suspension and see if it's going to stick and all of that. But they were taking a new product that seriously altered the geometry and putting it on an existing frame. And that would have been the easy way for us to approach this. It certainly would have been the more economical way. Again, we think about commitment to cutting molds is so expensive in order to open a new mold for a composite frame. But we said, and we, believe you me, we argued about this a lot within the company, is do we fully commit, if we're going to put a suspension fork on a Revolt, do we fully commit to creating an entirely new series of molds? And the answer was we either do it or we don't. And so we did it, and we committed to a full size run of new frames that are suspension augmented or suspension adjusted to accept a 40 millimeter fork. It's a gamble. Yeah. We'll see about how sales are universally. Again, it's definitely a risky move because we invested a lot into this frame to make sure that it handles correctly. We didn't want it to be, a tugboat and really sluggish. If you put on a longer fork on an existing frame, it would slack out the front end so much so that it would kill the characteristics of the bike. We didn't want to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a critical balance. And for the listener who kind of can't visualize, like with the suspension fork, your head tube there has to be a little bit more space, right? Because those forks are longer in order to add that 40 millimeters or whatnot of suspension in there. Mm-hmm. So there has to be an adjustment. And if you just slap it on your average bike, it's going to make it a little bit more relaxed. And maybe that is actually appropriate for how you're going to ride said bike, but is not the intended geometry that the designer put underneath you to begin with. So it is important to have someone thinking about those adjustments and designing them into the frame, geometrically speaking. But also you mentioned to me that you also added a little bit more beef to the head tube in an understanding that the bike is going to face different challenges and obstacles out there.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Craig. So if you think about this, so our existing Revolt Advanced Pro, a size medium, has a head tube length of about 150 millimeters. In order to properly compensate for the kind of that axle to crown length of a suspension fork, the Revolt X Advanced Pro that we're talking about today has a 115 millimeter head tube. So that head tube is significantly shorter in order to accommodate that longer lever arm of a suspension fork. And just like you indicated, in order to make sure that the bike would be safe, strong enough to handle that longer lever arm, the engineering of the frame is a bit different in order to handle that suspension fork.
Now, I know you've got a ton of experience personally and passionately about mountain bikes and the mountain bike world. When it came to putting a dropper post on that bike, what were you thinking, and how do you feel that the dropper post adds value in that particular bike?
For me, it was easy because I am a mountain biker, and within the company, I was an early adopter of a dropper seat post, and I can't imagine riding a bike today without a dropper seat post. It just has become part of the ride experience. And maybe I'm even more radical in thinking that pretty much every bicycle should have a dropper seat post on it. And I know I'm joking about the road side of things, but maybe I'm not joking about the road side of things. When it came to this product, especially considering its intent of being ridden over more rough terrain, varied terrain, that was a no-brainer. And so there is a dropper seat post on all of the models of the Revolt X.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you get no objection from me here. As everybody well knows, big fan. I would consider it an upgrade to any bicycle I have underneath me, but I will get off my soapbox, or maybe not even mount it today because I've been on it many times before on the pod.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about the fork and the dropper post, but let's talk about the frame and some of the other attributes. I know that there's some shared attributes between the Revolt Advance and the X in terms of like that flip chip. Let's drill into what that means, and let's talk about the tire size and capability of the bike.
Yeah, for sure. So some of the similarities between the two ranges, so that's the Revolt Advanced Pro and this new Revolt X Advanced Pro is, and that's one of the features you just mentioned, is the flip chip dropout. Flip chip dropout is simply a flippable chip that is located in the rear dropout of the frame. That dropout, whether it can be shifted from its low position or to its high position, that's 10 millimeters of difference. What that 10 millimeters does for yourself and for your listeners, you do understand that that will elongate the wheelbase, making it a more stable ride. I think more significantly than that even is that it allows for different tire size. So in its short position, when the flip chip is shifted forward, that allows for a 42 millimeter maximum tire size. If you really want
On a
to
700C, right?
700C, yeah. If you want to flip to the long position, that allows for a 53 millimeter tire in that long
Wow.
position.
Yeah, interesting.
That's pretty meaty.
What are the different lengths of the stays, if you recall?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but it is a 10 millimeter difference from the short
Okay.
position to the long position for sure.
Yeah.
All geometries are available on our website, so you can see, and that is size specific as well. That changes.
Got it. And then on the rigid fork on the Advance, is there a flip chip up front? Or
No,
okay.
we didn't see the need for it flip chip up front. You can run, a 53 millimeter tire. It doesn't matter. There is no flip chip up front. That's, we ask ourselves these questions when we're creating the product. That starts to get down the wormhole of how much is too much. You start adding a lot of features to a product like this. Obviously, that adds complication, that can add complexity and maintenance, and it can also add weight. So, what is really going to make a difference for the rider is something we always ask ourselves.
And when you design these bikes, are you designing strictly around a 700C wheel set, or are you also, accommodating a 650?
No, we think about 700C. I mean, the majority of consumers who are going to purchase this product or interested in purchasing this product certainly will ride a 700C wheel. I know others, including yourself, might want to run a different size wheel. You're obviously free to do that as well. But our geometries listed don't go down that rabbit hole of what if you use this size wheel.
Yeah, it's interesting. Several years ago, I think just sort of the design constraints or the vision at that moment was you needed to do 650B wheels in order to get that bigger tire size.
Yeah.
And now that you, like many others, are able to run 700 by 50 tires without changing geometry, to me, who was a big proponent of 650B a number of years ago, I'm sort of more open to the idea that, 700C, you got everything you could need. If you can go up to 700 by, in your case, 53, like I don't see a need for much more than someone on the bike packing margins to ever want more than that. And then to your point, like the bike, both aesthetically and performance wise, you go down to a 700 by 40, which maybe is a sort of standard-ish race size. Mm-hmm. You can take that tighter rear end with that flip chip, and you've got a supercharged race bike underneath you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so it does have that variability in it, and we're just seeing, we are seeing less 650B out there in the market because, again, we've been able to compensate very well for 700C. So we're pretty satisfied with that decision.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any other attributes of the bike that you would typically point out?
Well, the neat thing about it is, if you're a reader or if your listeners are familiar with the Revolt Advance Pro, one of the core features on that is what we call our diffuse handlebar and diffuse seat post. In general, kind of taking a big step back with Giant, one thing we've always been really proud of is not creating gimmicks. Integrated suspension systems, really, really complex things unique to frames like that. We try and avoid doing that kind of stuff because we see a lot of our competitors making those decisions to add whatever their own integrated suspension system. And that's not our angle. That's not what we're proud of. So when we introduce the technology, we want it to be effective, but we want it to be simple as well. Diffuse is our kind of flexible handlebar and flexible seat post. It's a D-shaped seat post. It's a D-shaped handlebar. It offers a little bit of compliance. No weight penalty, simplicity. It's not going to break. It doesn't require maintenance. And it's something that riders can feel. Now, obviously, the Revolt X that we're talking about today doesn't have that diffuse seat post. It has a dropper seat post, which does have a little bit of suspension in it, about 20 mils of suspension. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there are options for seat post. If you don't want to run a dropper, You can run a traditional round seat post if you want, or you can run our defuse seat post, which offers, I'll call it, 10 millimeters of fore or aft travel on it as well. So options
Okay.
for the rider, for the owner.
And for clarity, so that the defuse seat post, it's the frame accommodates a round seat post, but the diffuse has a D shape somewhere in the post.
No, well, so the entire seat post itself is D-shaped. It's using a
Okay.
series of shims. You can put in that D-shaped into our round seat tube, or you can use a different
Gotcha.
shim to put in a round seat post.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
options. The
One of,
bottom line is options.
one of the hallmarks I always think visually of the Giant design has been that sort of dropped seat stay.
Mhm.
And I know it's not just an aesthetic decision. What's the kind of design philosophy behind that?
Rudimentary suspension, if you think about it, it kind of creates a pivot point for the seat tube. If you think about it, your listeners can visualize this. The actual flexing of the seat tube is kind of pivoted off that drop stay. If you put the stay up in an old school traditional format, it would kind of negate that. So long story short, it offers a tiny bit of overall seat tube suspension as the seat post, as your seat, as your weight kind of pivots off that
Yeah,
pivot point.
that makes sense. And am I correct? Does that technology also translate, or maybe it originated on the road side of Giant's business?
Yeah,
Are the
so
road bikes kind of leaning into that compliance as well?
started way back when. Everything we just talked about started from the cyclocross side of things. Started with our
Okay.
TCX. TCX featured a lot of what we're talking about today. That was our test bed for diffuse. That was our test bed for kind of the drop stays. Because we all know how the sport of cyclocross has gone. It's kind of been superseded by gravel. But everything we just talked about today was tried on our cyclocross bike first. We proved it, and it moved on to Revolt, and then a little bit we'll move on to endurance road bikes as well, and
Yeah.
then to some degree onto high performance road racing as well.
Yeah. Interesting. I just had this other Giant model name pop into my head, and I think it might have been officially my first proper road bike I bought as an adult was a Giant Cadex.
Yeah, that's a really that's a poignant topic you're bringing up. So KDX was our first line of carbon fiber bicycles. Way back when, for one of the first mass-produced, not the first, but one of the first mass-produced carbon fiber bikes that consumers could buy, both road and mountain. That was innovative at the time, really complex to make, reasonably successful for us, but that went away. Um, Today, the KDX name lives on in our extremely high performance range of componentry that is separate from Giant. Those components can be found on many other brands as well, but that KDX name lives on moving into the future.
I recall it being reintroduced as a brand for those components, and I can't help but jump on the Wayback train when I'm
Well,
talking to you.
it's totally appropriate. I love jumping on the Wayback Machine and looking back, because the topic of the conversation, of the comments that certainly come up with Revolt X are, my gosh, it looks like an old school mountain bike. And I'll be honest with you, Craig, I just hopped in the garage. I have a Revolt X Advanced Pro Zero sitting in my garage. It's size extra large, and I just wanted to weigh it. Just this is actual production. This is the same bike you can buy. Again, size extra large. I'm a pretty tall rider, but it was 20 pounds, 15 ounces without pedals. So, that's fairly heavy. And I think you could get a hardtail mountain bike somewhere down within that realm of range. But these are two
Yeah.
totally different products that are geared towards two different riding experiences. So you can draw your
Yeah, that's
similarities, but it's different.
yeah, I get drawn into those debates as well. And living in the Bay Area and formerly living in San Francisco itself, I had a hardtail mountain bike. And I can tell you that while I touch the same terrain that I did back in my hardtail mountain biking days, I definitely ride it differently and create different loops because of the drop bars and the
Yeah.
gravel bike. It's definitely like it exists, and it's hard to describe potentially. It definitely exists in a different space in my mind and in my garage in terms of like where I'm going to go when I get on a gravel bike versus a mountain bike.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're speaking in generalities here, but I'm sure as heck not going to ride my mountain bike 15, 20 miles on the road to get to some mixed conditions. I'm not going to do that on my mountain bike. You can, but it's just not traditionally done. I would gladly do it on Revolt X, right? You pump up the tires and go for a 15, 20 mile, 30-mile road ride to get to those interesting BC roads or light single track. Different experience altogether.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, you would consider that a failure of a mountain bike ride if you had to ride for an hour, rode 30 minutes of dirt, and then rode an hour home on the road. That would not be a mountain bike ride.
No.
Whereas it's a perfectly fine gravel ride.
It's exactly what we intended when we created Revolt X.
Yeah, amazing. I will, Andrew, I'll put links in the show notes so everybody can find images of these bikes and find where to buy them from their local Giant dealer. And sure. I very much appreciated you coming on the show and talking a little bit about your history and the history of Giant, because it's such a storied brand that many of us have been familiar with for obviously, our entire cycling careers, that it's great to see it come full circle and for you guys to have such a, what I think is sort of a spot on spec for a modern gravel bike.
Well, great. Thanks for having me, Craig. I mean, I think it's a really interesting story, not only with this particular product, but kind of where it came from, what we were thinking, and how Giant was able to make it unique in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, the economics of the bike industry are important to consider, and the sort of engineering and manufacturing might that a Giant can put forth just kind of provides a lot of confidence, I think, for owners that, the bike has been well engineered, well tested, and didn't come out before it was ready.
Yeah. Thanks for noticing that. And that really was, a massive argument within the company. If we're going to do it, let's do it right. And let's commit to a frame that is suspension adjusted. So thanks for noticing that.
Yeah, of course. It was a pleasure talking to you, Andrew.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig.
That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Gravel Ride podcast. Big thanks to Andrew for joining the show and talking a little bit about Giant's history and a lot about that interesting Revolt X gravel bike that is now available in the United States. I look forward to seeing more front suspension running gravel riders out there in the world to join me. I certainly enjoy it in my local terrain. If you're interested in connecting with me, please visit www.theridership.com. The Ridership is a free global cycling community where you can connect with athletes around the world to talk all things gravel and gravel riding. There are two ways in which you can support the show if you're able to. Ratings and reviews or sharing this podcast with another gravel rider are hugely appreciated. Ratings and reviews are where podcasters get noticed. So reviews of the 5-star variety, if that's your opinion, are hugely helpful to what we do at the Gravel Ride podcast. Additionally, if you're able to financially support the show, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/thegravelride and contribute to our ongoing efforts to bring you coverage of the world of gravel cycling. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.